Christmas, maybe I should say messy Christmas to stay on point with our theme this weekend and as we kind of explore the Christmas story. And I do have a survey. This is an important survey. It's a scientific research, at least on my part. And I want to take you forward, a little less than 24 hours from now. Some of you will have already been up for about 11 hours. But I want to take you fast forward and I want to put you in your living room. The kids have been up. You guys are opening up gifts and presents and your living room. And there's two approaches to this moment around the Christmas season. And the first approach, and I'm going to do a little survey. I need to figure out in the room. We're a participatory church. I need you to give me some feedback on this. But how many of you would be in the OCD camp? You know what I mean? You've already got your garbage bag ready. You're the one that are gonna, every present that's unwrapped, give me that wrapping paper. You're separating the bows. You're folding it. You're putting it in. You're trying to test the limits of the Glad garbage bag. How many of you are in that camp of we're gonna clean as we go? Oh, so polite and organized, guys. Thank you. That's beautiful. How many of you are on the other side of this and you are it looks like a bomb hit my living room and it's okay because I'm enjoying the mess? Anybody? Oh, you see that? You see how they're a little louder, a little rowdier, a little more messy, right? A little more happy. Oh, those sound like fighting words. I gotta be honest with you, I have traditionally been on the OCD, clean as you go. That's how I was kind of raised, My mom wouldn't let me sit on the couch, you might crease it and do something there. But I am coming over to the dark side over the last couple of years. So I'm joining you guys that love the mess because what I've discovered, and probably what you'll discover and what is that there's something beautiful in the middle of the mess, isn't there? And we recognize that, the Christmas story and Christmas time isn't storybook perfect. No matter how hard the Hallmark movie channel tries to tell us, you can have the perfect storybook Christmas. You and I both know that there's no perfect Christmas, that it's just a little bit messy. In fact, sometimes, maybe oftentimes, it's more messy than merry. And so is life, isn't it? Because life, not just Christmas, can have the habit of reminding us that there are problems that we can't solve. There are people that we can't control. Some of you, crazy cousin Eddie is gonna be there at a party tonight or tomorrow, and you can't control him, right? And there are expectations that we can't meet, or expectations that we may have that are not met. And we bump into those things at Christmas time, but they're a little bit of a microcosm of the bigger challenges that we face in life, because life is messy. And actually the first Christmas was pretty messy. We get to this time of the year and we love the season and we anticipate all of that. But the first Christmas, the reason why you and I are gathered in this room this morning, the reason why, some 2,000 plus years removed from the first Christmas, these actual events that still impact our calendar, that still our culture kind of comes to a bit of a stop and a pause, that first Christmas was messy. There were crowded inns, there were traveling families, there were barnyard animals that were sniffing Jesus. There were some messy questions around that first Christmas. How did Mary get pregnant? What does Joseph tell his friends? What about cruel King Herod, who was taking the life of firstborns out of insecurity and a threat to his own rulership? There was no midwife for Mary. There was no bed for Jesus. In fact, we know that as the story unfolds, that Mary and Joseph end up being refugees that have to flee to Egypt. Now, we tend to clean up the Christmas story because we want it to fit nicely on our mantle. Some of you collect nativities and we want it to look nice, but the first Christmas, the world into which Jesus came was messy. In fact, Jesus was born into Israel, and Israel at that particular time was occupied by Rome. It was ruled by Rome, and it was heavily persecuted and oppressed and taxed. The people lived under a dictatorship or a rulership and were burdened. There was King Herod that was incredibly cruel to the people in his region. And then there were the religious elites. They were known as the scribes or the Pharisees, and they had externalized religion, and they had made it a whole bunch of rules that, were just a burden on the people if you were ever going to be righteous and holy. And it's into the middle of this mess that what we celebrate in this season, Jesus would come into the middle of this mess. And he would come to reintroduce humanity to who God actually is and how God relates to or wants to relate to his creation and relate to humanity. In fact, what we discover if we will give ourselves the opportunity to take a fresh look, to maybe pause for a minute and look afresh at the Christmas story, in the midst of all of the grittiness, in the midst of all of the mess, there is some beauty to be found. There's some truth to be found about who God is and how God relates to humanity. Now, there's a story that we don't oftentimes talk about during the Christmas season because we tend to focus, as we should, on Jesus coming and the manger and the Joseph and Mary and the shepherds and the angels singing and all of those things, which is beautiful. But there's a story of two people. In fact, they're the two oldest characters that are associated with what we celebrate as the Christmas story. And their names are Simeon and Anna. And they're both old. In fact, we're told that Simeon is approaching the end of his life, and we're told that Anna is 84 years old, and she's actually been a widow. She's been a widow for some 60 years. In that culture, she probably got married around the age of 16, and her husband died when she was around 23, 24 by estimates, and now she's 84 years old. She's approaching the end of her life. And in the midst of this story, are these two characters, they would have an encounter with Jesus that would transform their lives. And there's some truth, there's something that we learn about God from their interactions with this child, Jesus. And I wanna read you the story this morning, and then I just wanna leave you with just 3 very simple points about who God is and how God wants to relate to you and I. And this is what it says in Luke chapter 2, and I'm gonna read a few verses starting in verse 25. And it says, "Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him." The Holy Spirit is God. And had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When his parents brought in the child, Jesus, to do for him what was the custom of the law required, Simeon took him, Jesus, in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all the nations." Continuing on, it says that the child's father and mother, Joseph and Mary, marveled at what was said about their son, Jesus. There was a prophet named Anna and Peniel of the tribe of Asher. She was very old, and she had lived with her husband for 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until the 84th year. She never left the temple, but worshiped him day and night, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. Now, in this little story, there's a couple of things that I just want to point out, some things that we learn about God and how God would relate to us. And the first thing is this, is what we recognize from the story, not just this story, but from the Christmas story and throughout the entire Bible, is that Jesus meets us in our weakness and limitation. Now that sounds kind of strange, and maybe we bristle at that because, man, I don't want to be, I'm not supposed to be weak. I want to be strong. Come on, I want to take on the world. That's what we do, right? But when you read this story, what you recognize here is that these two characters, Simeon and Anna, were bumping up against the limitations, the fragility, the immortality in their own life. There was nothing that they could do to extend their life any further. They were approaching the end. And it's in this moment, as they were reaching the end, as they were bumping up against the frailty and the limitations of what it means to be human here on earth, it's in this moment that they meet Jesus, that they encounter the Messiah. Now, you and I, we live in a world, don't we, that kind of tells us a different story. It doesn't tell us a story about weakness. It tells us a story about power. It tells us a story about strength. In fact, we live in a culture, or we see narratives kind of repeated in our culture that kind of go along these lines. You can do it. Just do it. Dare to dream. If you think it, you can do it. My personal favorite, you do you. How's that working out? We live in a culture that kind of presents us with this narrative or this story that we can do this thing called life in our own strength. I believe I can fly. I believe I can touch the sky. Now, I've been on earth almost 51 years. Next weekend's my birthday, I'm 51. And in all my believing, I've never been able to fly. We have limits, don't we? There are things that we bump up against. And you may have experienced or bumped up against some of those human limitations, those pieces of life that you can't quite control. They're thrust upon you. You know that call from the doctor that nobody wants to get? Maybe there's some struggles in a relationship in your life. Maybe it's ice cold between you and your spouse. Maybe there's some challenges or difficulties in your family or with your siblings. Maybe your kids are not heading in the direction that you wished and hoped for and believed for and did everything you could in your power to try to get your kids to go in a particular direction and turn out to be the kind of person that you dreamed about. And maybe it's not gone as you thought it might. There's that struggle inside of every single one of us to do the things that we know we ought to do and not do the things that we know we ought not to do. Every one of us has some sort of definition of what we call good and evil, and we all struggle and wrestle with that. The Bible refers to that as sin. It's me just choosing my will over God's will, myself over God and others. And we all wrestle and we all struggle with that. And the challenge that what happens is as we struggle through life dealing with this thing called sin, it produces something in us that God didn't design us for, this kind of guilt and this shame that weighs us down, that burdens us, that further separates us from the life that God actually designed us for. And so we recognize that we bump up against these kinds of limitations. In fact, when you think about the Christmas season is so filled with excitement and anticipation and expectation, but what it gives way to is what they call now Blue Monday. And they say it's the most depressing day in January, or actually it's the day in January, it's the most depressing day of the year. You know that day when you all the decor's down, all the festivities are over, right? The wrapping's gone, the credit card bill's due, and you've gained yourself 10 pounds over the Christmas season, right? The struggle's real, people, because we live in a mess. There's a sin issue that all of us have to deal with. And the good news isn't that you can try hard enough, that you can earn your way, and if I just do enough good things, I'll overcome those bad things. The good news, and it's not gonna sound like good news because our culture has so conditioned us to believe that I can be the hero, I can be the champion, I can be the one that overcomes. But the good news goes something like this: in your powerlessness, in your weakness, in your limitation, and in your inability, there is hope. And hope isn't some ethereal, I dream about it, and maybe the Seahawks by some stretch can make it to the Super Bowl. No. It's the kind of hope that's rooted not in something, but someone who came not just to be born and to live the life that you and I could not live, would not live, and will never live, and then willingly go to the cross and give himself to deal with this mess, this struggle that rages inside of every one of us. You have hope because of Jesus. And Jesus shows up when we are weak. In fact, look what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. He says, my grace is sufficient for you. Like he shows up and says, I know you're struggling and you're wrestling and you're trying in your own strength and you keep bumping up against the mess and the limitation and the storms of life. But I'm here to tell you, and Christmas is all about this. I have a grace that is sufficient for you. And then he goes on and he says this, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. And so the starting point of all of this isn't, I'm going to try a little bit harder. The promise of Christmas and what we learn from this story of Simeon and Anna is that God shows up, Jesus shows up in the midst of my weakness when I cannot do it. And he says, I've got a grace that's sufficient for you. And it's actually in your weakness that my strength is made perfect. And it's a gift. It's a gift that he gives you. And it's the gift and the meaning and the message of the Christmas story. It's in that moment of meeting Jesus that I can give up the struggle. I don't have to strive in my own strength. I can surrender to him and allow him to forgive me, to receive the gift of life that he actually designed me for. In fact, when we meet Jesus like that, he changes our entire approach to life. And that's really the second thing that we see in this story is that Jesus changes our approach to life. Now, how many of you like waiting? Anybody? We had a few in the last service and it was crazy. We prayed for them, it was all good. So none of us like to wait. And so I thought there's a few things that might be a little bit funner than Christmas, and I wanted to show you some pictures. How about this one? How many of you think this is fun? Let's just wait at DMV for a little bit, right? This one's a little bit more seasonal. What about some traffic around Christmas time? I love living in Happy Valley. I don't like living in Happy Valley and trying to go around the Clackamas Mall at Christmas time, right? There's just traffic everywhere. And then what about this one? My last and personal favorite one, because some of you have been here over the last couple of days. That is not a TSA line, that is Costco. Some of you have been there. You spent 15, 20 minutes looking for a parking spot and then another, go in and get, whatever you needed at Costco plus the chicken plus the hot dog. Right? Come on. You're only laughing because it's true. But we find, we don't like to wait. Now, my growing up years, we had a little tradition at Christmas time. Grew up in Ireland, so I want you to just imagine what it was like. We had thatched roof and a little cottage, and there were leprechauns running around, gathering up four-leaf clovers, and they were making Irish Spring and Lucky Charms to bring to America. It was idyllic. It was a beautiful upbringing. It was awesome. Really good. Really, really good. But one of the traditions we had at Christmas time, that's not true, by the way, okay? That's only for the Americans that come and visit. Anyway, I grew up in Ireland. I digress. I grew up, and so we had a Christmas tradition in our house, which was that, you're young and you wake up early. Some of you are going to experience this. I encourage you parents to get a nap this afternoon. You're going to be up early. So we would get up early, but in our home, we couldn't just run into the living room. We had to go into my parents' bedroom. And then we had to sit on the end of the bed patiently while my dad went downstairs. And he moved slowly because he didn't want to upset. If Santa was still in the room, he didn't want to scare him away. So he had to move very slowly, very quietly. And then he opened up the door, creak, it would creak, And then he would check, and then he'd go in and make sure that the gifts were there, Santa wasn't still there. And then he would come back upstairs, and then he would send my mom down because she had to be in the room to see our faces when we came in. And then finally we could go. I feel like this weekend I've been able to get to the bottom of some of my impatience. And I think it roots back to Christmas as my childhood, right? We don't like to wait. We don't like to endure, right? Like life, we want life to be happy. We want life to just be easy and comfortable. And yet life can be challenging. Life can be enduring. And what we learn from this story is that when we encounter Jesus in the midst of our weakness, he gives us a different approach to life. And that's what you see in the story of Simeon and Anna, because Simeon and Anna, they're not enduring life. They're not begrudgingly trying to make their way through life, ho-hum, Eeyore, another day. You look at their story and the way it's described, they're expectant, they're anticipating something. And this is what Jesus does for us, that Jesus meets us in our weakness, in our limitations, in our fragility. He meets us in the middle of our mess, and he gives us not just forgiveness, he gives us an entirely different approach to life. One that anticipates, one that believes, one that expects, one that in spite of the storms, there's a peace and a life and a joy that we can encounter. And this is what you see in the life of Simeon and Anna. In fact, one of the keys, I think, to trying to understand how to approach life that way is actually found in the meaning of Simeon's name. Simeon's name literally means to listen intelligently. To listen intelligently. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm going through challenges and difficulties and there's things that just I have to grind away at in life, they're challenging for me, I don't listen intelligently. I listen impatiently. I can sometimes listen angrily. I can be frustrated in the midst of those moments. But Simeon has a different approach. And what I think God is trying to help us to understand in this story is that Simeon listened intelligently. What does that mean? Well, we see it in this passage because 3 times we're told that Simeon was led by God. See, Simeon had a relationship with God that allowed God to lead his life. And in leading his life, it doesn't mean that there was absence of challenges and storms and messes. That's just life. But what we recognize is that Simeon had a different approach to life because of his relationship with Jesus, because of his willingness to hear God, to obey God, and to follow God. He built his life not upon his own impulses. He built his life on God's word and following God's leading. And it gave him the opportunity to approach life from a different perspective. You know, when we build our life based on a relationship with Jesus, when we follow his word, it transforms how we live. In fact, Jesus, or Paul in Philippians chapter 1, he says this, "Of this I am sure." How many of you are sure what you're getting tomorrow for Christmas? Right? Some of you, that's because you looked. We just, if you're sitting next to somebody that looked, you just poke them right now and say, you shouldn't have looked. Shouldn't have looked at my Amazon purchases, right? But there's not a lot of life that we're sure about. Maybe death and taxes, right? But Paul says this, "Of this I am sure." What is it that you're sure of that allows you to live life with that kind of sense of expectation and anticipation? And what he says is this, "Of this I am sure, that he, God, who began a good work in you, will bring it to completion." See, God doesn't just kind of visit you and then live at a distance. God comes to be with you. And isn't that the story of Christmas? I mean, isn't that the message of this whole season and the first Christmas story? That Jesus, one of the names that Jesus was given by his Father was the name Emmanuel, which means God with us. And if God is with us, we don't have to go through life on our own. It can change our approach to life. Last thing that we learn from this story is simply this. Jesus meets us in our weakness and limitation. Jesus gives us a different approach to life, but Jesus surpasses our expectations. Simeon had the distinction of being the only person in the Bible, so far as I can tell, that we're told is explicitly holds the Christ child in his arms. And in that moment, it's this striking visual of not just a God who is distant and a God that Simeon would meet. This is a story now of somebody that is received. He wasn't just looking at Jesus at a distance. It says that he actually received him. He held him. And in that moment for Simeon, God goes from being God with us to now being God with me. And what it produced in him wasn't just, now I can make it through the moment. It actually set Simeon up to be able to move forward with peace. Now, you see, we live in a world that in the midst of the storms, in the midst of the mess, in the midst of all that goes on in our lives, it might be in you, it might be around you, but in the midst of all of that, we have this deep desire, every single one of us, for peace. Peace with God, peace with myself, peace with my family, peace with the world in which I live. And the challenge is that none of us can find that peace in ourselves. None of us can find that peace in some sort of external that we find here on earth. That kind of peace can only be found in a relationship with Jesus. See, we oftentimes think of peace as the absence of a storm. And I'm here to tell you that peace is the presence of God with you in the midst of the storm. And that's the story of Christmas. In fact, 700 years before Jesus would be born, a prophet by the name of Isaiah, and we quote this a lot at Christmas time, in Isaiah 9 and verse 6 said that there's a child who's coming. He's gonna be a rescuer. The government's gonna be on his shoulders. He's gonna be a wonderful counselor. But the last title that's given to him is this: he's gonna be the Prince of Peace. It says in Ephesians that he gives you a peace that passes all understanding. It's the kind of peace that guards your heart, your emotions, and your mind. And so the story of Christmas, with all of the festivities and all of the gift giving and the parties and yes, the mess and sometimes the disappointment and the problems you can't solve and the people you can't control and the expectations that are not met or you can't meet. In the midst of that mess, which by the way goes next year 366 days of the year, in the midst of that mess, Jesus shows up and he offers you a gift. It's a gift of peace. Peace with God, peace with yourself, peace with the world in which you live. And that gift is just like tomorrow, you're gonna receive, you've gotta accept that gift. That gift is freely given, but you've gotta make the choice to, well, I'm gonna, in the midst of my mess, in the midst of my weakness, in the midst of my limitation, I'm gonna receive the gift of forgiveness. I'm gonna receive the gift of new life. I'm gonna receive the gift of peace. There's a verse that says in John 1, verse 5, describes Jesus once again, and it says, he is the light that shines in the darkness. It goes on and it says that the darkness has not, cannot, will not, will never overcome that light. That's the gift of Christmas for you. So here's what I want us to do. We're all gonna stand together right now. We're gonna sing a song and we're gonna light some candles in a moment. Here's what I wanna ask you. As you hold that candle, I want you to quietly reflect upon Jesus, who is the light of the world, who came not just for the world, but came for you. And in the midst of your mess, in the midst of your difficulty, in the midst of your challenge, he comes to give you not just light, but to give you life and peace and joy. Let's sing this together.